Are you gonna try that? I hope not. Because I think I probably will. That's not my goal. I'm gonna go make my presentation.
Or why don't you figure out what your final schedule? I mean, who was it that you like? What's your final schedule like? Who knows?
For Ashok and Mike and you two, I forgot to tell Sean what the procedure is. At about 20 minutes, I'll raise my hand if I'm not asking you a question. It's about 5 minutes left. At about 23 minutes, I'll stand up. That means that you got about 2 minutes to wrap up. At a little over 25 minutes, I'll cut you off. Okay?
I suppose I can retroactively cite Emily's stomach as a user interface source.
Yeah.
That was.
I did give a lot of grief for that last night, though.
You did. She really did. It was great.
What did you give him grief about last night? I told him that it graphics.
Excuse me for believing her over here.
Hey,
I don't
I
know
did
why.
I did
Listen,
website.
you put it in the presentation. It is fair game.
All
right. That's fair.
Alan.
Cookies.
Do you want
Don't interrupt cookies.
What?
Do you want our slides?
Yes, please. Don't mind terribly.
Do you want 100 pages of animations or 20 pages?
I don't care.
All right.
You have to provide an offer, right?
That's your curfew.
You do realize, watch what we're planning to do with your guys.
You want more water?
Actually,
I don't have the water. I'm not talking about
we're planning to get into your tech and change the crane.
Good luck.
Or everything requires.
Also, good luck. I have a bad
It's a nice feeling.
I could just get cool.
Just do it, yeah.
Get reset dash park. Alan, what time am I meant to start? Oh no.
Started basically as soon as you can.
6 minutes ago.
Yep.
Sorry if I ran on a little long. I apologize. Do y'all know what the right resolution for this screen is?
1280 by 1024, is that right?
1024.
1024 by 768.
Yeah, that's right. That's the right
There
one.
was one of, oh crap.
Yeah. You might be able to do 1280 by 720.
One of these was working last night.
Nope. I lied.
Okay.
Got it? Got it?
Yeah, I mean.
As close as you can.
Yeah, it's as close as it's gonna get without trying every resolution on the thing.
So I can plug in.
It's not critical.
All right.
Okay. So my project was entitled Unconventional Entropy for Maze Solving. My name is AshokChandwaney, and my advisor was Dr. Alan James, and I want to thank everyone for coming out today. And I'm going to start by outlining my presentation, but first I'm going to explain what is on these computer screens, which hopefully all of you can see right now. They're mazes which are being solved, and that one is being solved with the help of that convenient lemon battery right there. This one is being solved with the help of the computer's webcam, which is taking the images, not saving them anywhere, and then using them to help make random choices about where to turn. So for my presentation, I'm going to start off by giving some background for my work, talking about some of the prior work, context, and research that I did before beginning, and the development process for the code that you see running on these computers and that was up on the screen a moment ago, and talk about some possibilities for future work and answer your questions and the questions of our department professors. So starting with background, one of the things that came out of the Edward Snowden revelations was that the NSA has compromised at least the RSA, which is a security firm's random number generator called dual elliptic. Now, generating random numbers securely is absolutely crucial for secure communication over the internet. The random numbers are the basis of how OIT can't read my email, because they're used to encrypt my email before it goes through OIT's network, or how no one can read your email except you, Gmail, and the person who it's supposed to go to. So because of the NSA's exploit, or because of the flaw that they got put into the dual elliptic generator that RSA used, they were able to brute force encryption in 1/10,000th of the time that it should take when the encryption was based on the dual elliptic random number generators. That's a lot faster than they should be able to do that. So securely generating random numbers is pretty important for communication on the internet, and all of our software random number generators, or at least a lot of them, are suspect now that we know that the NSA has been tampering with some of them. Shifting gears a little bit, organic batteries. Up here there's a lemon battery, which is set up very similarly to the way the potato battery is set up on screen. The pieces of copper and zinc respectively go into the potato or lemon, and then they're connected into either the multimeter or the Arduino up here with some wires, and then the Arduino essentially is serving as a digital multimeter in this circuit, piping the information that you would read off of the screen of our multimeter here into the computer, which then processes it for its computations. The reading will go down over time as the lemon battery runs out of juice. Get it? Juice? Yeah, that's the one joke. And I wanted to talk about a previous project, which is related to this that I've done. It was entitled The Potato Philosophers, and it used several potato batteries connected to an Arduino in a similar manner to this, and sent the potatoes random numbers that they were generating off to the Google autocomplete engine, which then used it to produce fully complete questions like how do people bully, and other really interesting ones from the potatoes. So the last thing that I want to talk about before going into, not the last thing, the second to last thing I want to talk about before going into development is different sources of randomness. The ones that were considered for this project were organic batteries, like the lemon battery or potato battery, which would have been similar to the lemon but had a little less juice in it, or a little less electrical potential in it. Webcams, which are, yeah, you get it. Webcams, like the one that's driving this maze solving process up here. And then finally, human or other bioelectricity, which could be read using an open source circuit called Spikerbox, which was not completed for time and budget constraints. The very last thing I want to talk about is maze solving methods. That's what the laser pointer is for. So there were a couple different maze solving methods which were seriously considered for use in this project. The first one was the wall follower, which, okay, I don't think that's gonna work. The wall follower, which would like pick one, either the start of the maze is up here, the goal is that red square down there. The wall follower would pick either the left or the right wall and then just stick to it. So if I was a wall follower on the right wall, I would just go like that. And at every possible chance I have to turn, I would just follow the right wall. And eventually, I would reach a dead end right here, right? And then I would just keep following that wall. So it would turn me around and it would get me out of the dead end. And eventually, I would make it to the goal, even if it meant going into every dead end in the maze. That was discounted because the goal of this maze demonstration was to illustrate the different types of randomness as they're generated. And the wall follower will always do the same thing. It'll always follow the one wall. And so that doesn't seem to really illustrate randomness. The second option which was considered is an artificial intelligence technique called simulated annealing. And well, I'm not going to go too far into the method of simulated annealing in this talk. Suffice it to say, it requires a lot of random input as difficult to visually represent. And the difficulty of visually representing that also sort of precluded it from consideration for this project. So the final method, which was decided on, is random walk, which I'll get a little more into later. So now I'm going to talk about the development, starting with random walk, as I've just promised, or starting with a little bit of background first. So for the maze framework, which is the code that you see running on these computers right now, the mazes, you'll note, between these two computers are not the same, because every time the program is started or every time a new maze is started, the maze is generated automatically, dynamically. So it's a new maze every time, and the code that does that was public domain code available from a website, Rosetta Code, which offers code samples in different languages for comparison's sake. The data structure which these mazes are stored in are parallel two-dimensional lists. So there's a two-dimensional list which has all the information about the cells, like whether it's a wall or whether it's a path and how many times it's been visited. And then there's a second two-dimensional list which is aligned with that first two-dimensional list that has all the UI elements. So index 1, 1 corresponds from the first set of lists to the second set of lists. I want to talk about the way that the decisions are made, or the way that the solver acts. This is a random walk technique. At each step, if there is a decision, so continue straight until there is a decision to be made. And then at each step, if there is a decision to be made, e.g. there's more than one possible direction that the solver could go, get a list of all the choices, disregard the cell that we just came from, because we don't want the solver to just turn around running back and forth chasing its tail forever. And then using the appropriate method of randomness, pick one of those choices. Now, the part that I want to focus on here is using the appropriate method of randomness, because that's really the meat of this project. So the first type of randomness that I'm going to go into depth here is the biological input from that lemon battery right there. The original plan with the biological input was to just take the reading from the lemon and provide it directly to the maze solver in order to make a selection from the list of choices. This means that, a little bit of background on the way this setup works. The Arduino is capable of reading voltages in the range of 0 to 1.1 volts, and it ascribes the values 0 and 1023 respectively, and everything in the middle of that voltage range is assigned the corresponding middle value of the numeric range. Lemons, typically around 0.8, 0.9 volts, a particularly strong one might be 1.1 or a little higher. I think this one is about 0.6 volts right now. And so over time, as they're exhausted, the number which is read by the Arduino, which corresponds to the amount of voltage that's left in the lemon battery, decreases. Unfortunately, that means that there are times where the value will be repeated over and over and over again. And up here, this is an example of a maze layout which caused the lemon to get stuck. The repetition of the value over and over again caused it to make the same decision over and over and over again, and that made it stay in this cycle for like 4 or 5 minutes before I took the picture that you see here now. So that was sort of a problem, and it was sort of a problem because it represented a lack of randomness in the data being collected from the lemon. It wasn't actually very random at that point. It was just repeating over and over again. So to figure out a way to process that input that would make it a little more genuinely random, went back and looked at what exactly the information that we had available from this lemon was. And the first thing is the red value, the number that the Arduino is giving us, which corresponds to the voltage available in the lemon at a given time. Additionally, we have the change in value from the last time we read it to this current time. When it's stuck on the same number, when it's staying on the same number for a while, that's going to be 0, but sometimes it'll change, usually not by more than 1. Third, we know how many times we've seen this value before without it changing. And finally, we know the number of values that we've read in total. Now, for proceeding and trying to figure out a way to use this available information in order to have some sort of passively random input from the lemon, discarded the number of values that have been read total, because including that would have sort of just left us with an Arduino that was counting for us and not really had any sort of randomness or a lot of randomness from the lemon, so much as from the Arduino just like counting forever. So what the approach that we took to figure out how to filter those three pieces of data, the red value, the change, and the number of times we've seen this value before, is through a technique called evolutionary algorithms, where essentially the computer figures out the best way to program itself for you. Now, a quick outline of the way that evolutionary algorithms could work is that it could generate 40 random functions. In my case, that would have been functions from 3 variables, the red value, the change, and the number of times we've seen this value before, to a single value, the random output. So it would generate 40 random functions, and those could be anything from like f of x1, x2, x3 equals 0 to like f of x1, x2, x3 equals x1 minus x1. There are a lot of possibilities. And then we check how good they are in the evaluation step. We see whether or not they're doing what we want. And then we keep the 5 best options. This is a way that the evolutionary algorithms could have worked. In my project, notably, we used distributed evolutionary algorithms for Python, the deep library, and that sort of took care of most of this. I'm outlining this as a way of explaining how it worked, but not specifically how it did work in my project. So after the evaluation step, we keep the 5 most promising functions, the 5 ones that produced the most desirable output, and then we replace the 35 that we threw out by either randomly generating new functions or combining bits and pieces of the last generation of functions in interesting ways or changing them somehow. And then we repeat the evaluation step and the regeneration step for a set number of generations until we stop and have, hopefully, our good outputs. Now the tricky part here is the evaluation step, because for this step to work, you have to be able to define for the computer, you have to be able to give it a function that expresses exactly what you want. Recall that this is in the context of making my solver not get stuck in loops. The solver is never going to have more than 3 possible directions it can go in, and typically it doesn't have more than 2 with the generation algorithm that we used. So how do we define randomness in a way that the computer can evaluate in the range of numbers 1 to 3? And the answer to that, or the approach that we took, is through a modified version of what's called the serial test. We look at every possible combination of those 3 numbers that is 3 long, every 3 tuple. So that's 1, 1, 1, and then 1, 1, 2, and then 1, 1, 3, and then 1, 2, 1, etc., etc. So for each possible 3 tuple that we have with these 3 numbers that we're looking for randomness on, we go through the list of numbers we're trying to check for randomness. In the case of the evolutionary algorithms, this list was the output of the function across 6,000 sample readings of the lemon battery. So we take the output of that function, and we look at every subset of 3 consecutive numbers in it, and we see which 3 tuple it is. And then we record how many times each of the 3 tuples are repeated in the set of 6,000 outputs. Finally, we take that knowledge, which is a list of all the possible 3 tuples and how many times they occurred, and see how evenly they're all distributed. So a more even distribution would be a more theoretically random, would represent a more random set of numbers, because that means that at a given point, at any number in the set, the next 2 numbers have an equal probability of being any 2 numbers. If there were a lot of the 3 tuple 1, 1, 1, for instance, we would have a much higher probability of a 1 following a 1 than if we had an even distribution of the 3 tuples. So going back to these 4 columns of data, of which only 3 were considered in the evolutionary algorithms, it turns out that the result of the genetic algorithm, which was run multiple times, is that the most effectively random function, given the modified serial test I just described, is to take the red value and add the number of times that the value has remained unchanged to it. This contains an insight into the nature of randomness inside of a lemon battery, which is that one of the more unpredictable, or at least one of the unpredictable components of a lemon battery is the speed at which the voltage drops, or the speed at which the readings that the Arduino is taking change, which is why it was in all of the results from the evolutionary algorithms. It's important to note that this function, which was produced by the genetic algorithms, was compared with a list of pseudo-random numbers, or the output of this function was compared with a list of computer-generated pseudo-random numbers, and this function produces random numbers based on the lemon's input, which are a couple orders of magnitude on that fitness function that I described behind the pseudo-random numbers. That's to say, it's not quite as good. The last thing I want to talk about is the webcam approach, which is running on this computer right here. The webcam captures an enormous amount of data every frame, right? Like 700 or 720p is a pretty big chunk of data per image. And so it was kind of difficult to know where to start with that. Like, do we just take the red channel? Do we just look at certain pixels? Ultimately, it made sense to use a hash function, which is a function that maps from all of the possible files to numbers. It's a one-to-one function, or ideally a one-to-one function. Many hash functions are known to have what's called collisions, where two files will map to the same output, but those are uncommon. And one important characteristic of hash functions is that similar inputs produce dissimilar outputs. So the difference between me being in front of my computer and breathing in versus me being in front of my computer and breathing out would be wild when reflected in the hash of those images, in the result of the hash function run on those images. Additionally, imaging noise will also play into this. So even if it's like the same image twice, there would be subtle variations that would produce a difference in the output of the hash function. We tested this, or verified it, using 1,400 consecutive images taken on my webcam of myself, many of which, or for about half an hour of which, I was sitting in a lecture, not moving. And the numbers that the hash function produced under the serial test, or the modified serial test, performed on par with a list of pseudo-randomly generated numbers. That's really good, because that means that these numbers under our test, which is admittedly not statistically rigorous or mathematically rigorous, are just as good as random numbers generated by the computer's algorithm for generating random numbers. Now, at first I thought, oh my god, that means that we can just use our webcams for secure random numbers and for public key encryption, and like, boom, take that NSA problem solved. Turns out not so fast, because while small changes in input will produce large changes in output by the function, there are some things that most webcam images are going to have in common if they're taken while someone's trying to check their Gmail. Namely, that you're going to be sitting in front of your computer. And while that doesn't mean that we're going to have like a chunk of numbers, like we won't have the range 700,000 to 900,000 be where all of those images of people in front of their computers go. But it means that there could be discernible patterns in the output of hash functions on webcam images of people in front of their computers that could sort of undermine the theoretical unpredictability of webcam hashes. So that leads us into suggestions for further work. First and foremost, pursuing the webcam random number generation option would be really interesting and require a lot of statistical analysis and other rigorous mathematics. Additionally, I don't know that it's super plausible to use an array of lemon batteries to produce random numbers, but I think that there are some things that could be learned in pursuing that as a research option, which make a lemon secure data center a worthwhile project for future research. Additionally, or as I said, webcam security. And finally, one thought that I had while I was sitting in front of my computer as it was running this code was, what if I go like that? Will that make it turn right? I know it needs to go right. Come on, go right. And I think it would be really interesting to talk to other people who don't necessarily know that like that's just not how it works because it's hashed and there's no pattern to it, and see if they felt like they were discerning some pattern or if they were kind of reverse engineering how the computer translated what they were doing in front of their webcam into decisions made by the maze solver in real time. So that concludes the talking part of my presentation. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you again to my advisor, all of the computer science professors, and all my friends who got me through it.